Ready to rock and roll and have some fun today. We actually had a great discussion last night. I wanted to pick up where we left off. I'm a little bit sick of talking about Super Tuesday. It's already got me bored, and it was a pretty sleepy Tuesday anyway. But I think it's important. It's anymore actually really difficult to scratch beneath the surface because everything we're force-fed is just a repetition of the same. So what I'm going to do is actually just open this up because my favorite part that I actually miss about the campaign, but that I've enjoyed in traveling even in recent weeks, is hearing questions from the people and engaging in actual unfiltered dialogue. And so what I'm going to do is to talk about a few things that I think deserve to be discussed that haven't maybe made top news headlines in the political press, share a few thoughts to kick us off. And then Caroline, who's with me, is going to actually read off on the multiple different live streams the questions that come in. So just type them in. We'll get to as many as we can, and that's my favorite part of really doing any of this stuff, is hearing from all of you guys. One thing I'll say is start with an interesting observation. Bitcoin hit its all-time high, and that got a lot of headlines, but what's actually at stake there? It's one of those issues that kind of itched me a little bit over the course of the campaign, watching other politicians talk about this, but let's get to the heart of what's going on. First of all, Bitcoin is not the same thing as other forms of cryptocurrency. And a lot of politicians mess that up. Even at times when I've talked about it, I talk about them from a policy perspective in the same category. But the underlying thing is actually quite different. Bitcoin is something that is, by definition, scarce and limited, confined in its quantity. It's mathematically defined by formula. There's a finite supply. And that's really different from any other form of paper that you can just, quote unquote, print more of, whether it's a fiat currency or whether it's a made-up cryptocurrency. Now, there's things on both sides of this debate that I find interesting, but it's worth actually calling out and settling. On one hand, you have the Bitcoin people who recognize that it is different from the other categories of cryptocurrencies because of that finite supply and because of the nature of the mathematical grounding of its inherent value. But that should not be a reason for regulating the other forms of cryptocurrency any more aggressively than they need to be, because part of the promise of Bitcoin in the first place was indeed to have total freedom in a way that was an opt-out from an oppressive regulatory or financial infrastructure. And so I think it's somewhat contradictory when you have the people who appropriately want Bitcoin recognized for what it is, to be free from financial overreach and regulation, many of them at least falling into the trap of thinking that, well, we don't want it for me, but we do want it for thee. I do think that's a mistake. It's the mirror image of the mistake that people in the rest of the crypto community make when they try to pretend that every other made-up cryptocurrency with unlimited supply and infinite supply is the exact same as Bitcoin when it's not. One of the things I've also gained an appreciation for is that many of the people who are nominal proponents of Bitcoin or a different cryptocurrency often forget the why of why they were, or at least many before them were, attracted to its existence in the first place. See, a lot of politicians today, I'm not picking on anybody, but I'm just going to call it like I see it. Somebody like RFK is perceived as being a big friend of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space because he makes mention of it, without recognizing that the whole project was about freedom in the first place, recognizing that it's fundamentally incompatible to say that I'm going to come after your Second Amendment rights, that I'm going to actually regulate what you can and cannot say about the climate. People who have claimed for putting people in prison if they spread climate misinformation. It's great that you support Bitcoin nominally, but the very spirit of supporting Bitcoin was rooted in freedoms in the first place. And there's a little bit of a puzzle, and I haven't fully formed my opinion on this, but I have to at least make the observation of the real, what should we say, cult following behind even the leadership of a guy who's doing a good job in a lot of respects, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, but who nonetheless has taken, I think, an iron fist to governing, not by any stretch a libertarian approach. And yet, because of the acceptance of Bitcoin as legal tender in that country, has attracted the following of many Bitcoin and cryptocurrency fans. And so I think that that's just one of these issues where, yes, you see Bitcoin's trading at an all-time high, a lot of people in the Bitcoin community rallying behind that, and same thing when other cryptocurrencies do well. People think of themselves as something more than traders, as you would think of a commodity trader in the past. It's fine if you want to speculate and make money, but if you're wearing that ideological veneer then when you're looking at folks from RFK to Bukele to otherwise, I think it's worth just remembering, wait a minute. It's one thing if I'm holding an asset and it's appreciating and I'm happy about that, but it's another if my ideological commitment to that asset really matches up to the ideological commitments of other people who claim to be the proponents of that asset. And there I see actually a pretty big disconnect. And it's one of these moments where we get so accustomed to thinking about the what, right? We were attracted to Bitcoin because of what it represented, that if the people who then prop up or advocate for the use of Bitcoin are betraying those same underlying libertarian principles in other ways, it's up to us to still be able to parse that distinction. And that's something that I think in this second wave of Bitcoin proponents and other cryptocurrency proponents, that second wave we've actually lost. And so that's something that's been itching me for a little while. I'd love to open up some conversation on that, and we'll take some questions soon after I finish, listing a few of these topics that I wanted to throw on the table for discussion today. The other one is we've heard a lot in recent weeks about Leticia James's shameful, and I think it is just nothing, there's no other word I could think of for it, shameful pursuit of jungle politicized justice by actually pursuing $450 million rulings against Donald Trump in a case in which, literally, nobody lost money. Every person who did business with Donald Trump wasn't some ordinary consumer, but was a sophisticated financial institution that made money from dealing with him and yet is still pursued on the back of a consumer fraud statute. We've heard plenty about that in the news. What I think was really interesting was on the back of bringing that case, that same Attorney General, Leticia James, brings, what do you know, another case against meat manufacturers in the state of New York. Now, this is interesting. People say, oh, why is Vivek going to defend meat manufacturers? I'm a vegetarian. Yes, I am a vegetarian on completely separate grounds in the way I live my personal life. But that's different from the way our law and our country is supposed to function. Her basis for going after these meat manufacturers, completely unjust, is that they are going to be unable to meet their self-imposed greenhouse gas reduction goals. So think about this. She is going after these meat manufacturers saying that they're producing too much meat, and the fact that they're producing more impedes their ability to meet their own carbon reduction goals. And somehow that's now a crime, that you have an attorney general literally bringing criminal or criminal-like proceedings against a company for doing what that company was actually set up to do, to meet consumer demand for a particular type of food that that company produces. So I got interested in this case, and you dig beneath the surface, it's a microcosm of everything that's going on in our culture, actually. Look at what's going on there. She's going after them for doing what they were set up to do. But her case is going after these meat manufacturers, saying that the company itself claimed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, and that she says, based on her study of the business, they don't have the technology to possibly meet those goals if they're increasing meat production at the rate that they are. And she says that because consumers, everyday consumers apparently, she says, are willing to pay 30% more for a product that is actually carbon neutral or environmentally friendly as it relates to carbon emissions, they're defrauding the consumer. Same kind of bogus theory she's bringing against Trump as some sort of consumer protection racket. Here's the same thing in the name of consumer protection, because consumers pay more money, 30% more for meat or other products that was made in a carbon neutral manner. That's her basis for seeking damages from this meat producer. So let's think about that for a second. One thing is, it rests on the idea that they couldn't possibly meet those goals in the future because this half-educated attorney general has decided that they don't have the technology to do it. I don't think we want attorneys general making those judgments off the hip anyway. But the second point is, it shouldn't be a crime to fail to meet carbon emission reduction targets in the first place. But the third point is, why is it that consumers were interested in paying a higher price for those products that were produced with lower greenhouse gas emissions in the first place? And I think that's the most interesting part of this, is she couldn't have brought that case if it weren't for the fact that ordinary people, we the people, if you will, were actually demanding that companies do provide those products and pay more for products that were supposedly made in carbon neutral circumstances. Which reveals the heart of what's going on in our culture right now, is these attorneys general, these elite actors, are exploiting an underlying insecurity in us, in we the people, demanding that we have our meat manufacturers or our food producers adopt carbon neutral standards. And when they're unable to do it, but they effectively virtue signal that they are, then you have politicized actors like Leticia James going after them. And so that politicized justice, that's a big part of the focus of what we need to correct in this country. But that can really only happen if you have an underlying consumer demand that also is rationalized, that actually goes back to demanding products and services rather than virtue signaling that's actually what's sold and on offer. And I think many of those same threats to liberty that you see from the attorneys general like Leticia James are the ones that only work if you have a culture like ours that's willing to actually accept it. So those are two, I think, off the beaten track stories that interested me this week that I don't think got talked about enough, but get to the heart of what's really going on. You know, another one that I would just add to the mix is something that fascinates me. It's not a political point per se, but it's one where we do see some element of bipartisanship that caught my attention, which is the bipartisan assault on Apple's market power. It's antitrust laws being applied against Apple and its App Store. So this is really interesting, and I think it has profound implications both for our politics and our economy, but also even some business opportunities for the enterprising-minded who might take advantage of this. The DOJ is effectively going after Apple, saying that the way that it allows app developers to access its own App Store on its iTunes Store is effectively an antitrust violation because app developers are put at a competitive disadvantage to Apple's own products, and Apple only allows developers to access their own App Store, the iTunes Store, for a 30% cut that Apple gets of those profits. So they say that makes Apple too powerful of a company. And the fact that this is bipartisan, right? So a lot of this came from Democrats, but you have prominent Republicans also supporting it. In this case, both MAGA, America First Republicans, and even some traditionalist Republicans suggest to me that it is going to be a matter of time before we see the levers of antitrust law used by both parties, probably in the foreseeable future, to at least downsize the sheer scale of a company like Apple. And when that happens, I actually think there's going to be potentially major business opportunity for those who are willing to capture it in the arena of privacy. See, the antitrust suits, I think, miss where the real action is. I think the real action here is that this is a company that is able to exercise that power because of the scale of insight they have into every action that you take using one of those iPhones, and a relationship with the government that allows Apple to serve as the vehicle for that government to eventually play a role in having a lens into every aspect of your life, the civil libertarian's nightmare. Now, with that breakup of Apple, I'm not saying that that's happening anytime soon, but I think that is where this could be going. I think it creates a lot of room in the marketplace for competitors. Let's say an Apple competitor whose sole product was based on the fact that nobody, not Apple, not the company, could see what message you actually send using one of their devices. Not just what Signal or what some of these applications are right now are claiming to do on an Apple iPhone, but an actual hardware product that was truly encrypted end-to-end and could be wiped clean such that you're the only person, not some iCloud that actually has a vision into what you're doing. That's going to be for people who are skating to where the puck is going from a business standpoint. What I see is some writing on the wall from both political parties suggesting that there's going to be some level of antitrust action taken against Apple. You're already seeing it in recent days from the EU. It now looks like that's coming to the US. I think that's going to be a potentially seismic shakeup of the way we see the smartphone marketplace and the application marketplace evolve. And I think that's something that actually is outside the realm of politics, but an interesting trend that I'm keeping my eyes on, not just out of my interest as somebody who's a citizen and somebody who's had an interest in the impact of politics on business, but also somebody who even, would see probably as my capacity as an investor over the next 6-7 years. I think that'd be a pretty interesting new area for new company formation as well. So anyway, thought those were some thoughts that I had that I thought were pretty interesting from this week that I didn't really see covered by the traditional mainstream press or the political class. But it's good to be talking to all of you guys again, and I'm here with Caroline, who's going to open up for some questions that we might take over the next half hour or so. What do you say?
We got a lot.
All right, let's do it.
Guys,
let's open it up.
Keep dropping your questions as Vivek is answering them. We're getting them in real time. So Don't hold back, as you always say. And if there's more news stories that you guys feel weren't covered this week, drop those in the chat as well. So this first question is from Tanner Desmond.
Okay.
Sounds like it is straight out of 1776, but applies to 2024. How can we stop and prevent political persecution in this country?
Well, I think the first is actually restoring the authority of the people we elect. So at the state level and at the federal level, what you do have in this country is prosecutors in some cases are elected. I actually don't love that model. I don't think the prosecutor should necessarily be the elected party, because what you see is the likes of Leticia James, who, and Alvin Bragg for that matter. Actually, Alvin Bragg and Leticia James share something in common here, who ran for elected office on the promise of going after Donald Trump. They couldn't tell you what statute they're going to go after him for. They just gave you the man, and then they said, I'll give you the crime later. And both of them actually did exactly that. They promised their voters the fact that they were going to go after this man. They didn't tell them how. They got into office. They did go after the man. They found some statute to justify it in two completely separate, albeit what I believe fraudulent cases. That's, I think, one of the dangers of having publicly elected judges and prosecutors. But what you do need is some level of public accountability for the people who are appointed to those roles. So right now, what's happened is the inverse of that problem. Should we want all of our prosecutors to be elected? Actually, and our judges to be elected? I actually don't think so. But what you do want is an elected leader of the executive branch, a president or a governor, president at the national level, governor at the state level, who has direct control and direct accountability for the actions of that Justice Department that sit under them. And what's happened in the U.S. today, especially at the federal level, is you have so many layers of disintermediation, right? You got the DOJ led by the Attorney General, but underneath that you have the investigative unit of the FBI. A lot of layers of separation that make sure that even the person who's elected to run the government, the U.S. president, is so far separated from the prosecutorial and investigative decisions that are made that the people who lead those units become kind of demigods in their own right, unaccountable altogether, accountable to nobody. And so what you need is neither the fully elected model for the prosecutor, nor, though, the completely detached model, but one in which the U.S. president is accountable every 4 years, the governor every 4 or 6 years back to the people of their state and to their country, to have actual direct oversight over the people who are wielding the levers of prosecutorial power. Are there dangers to that? Yes, there are. I mean, you could imagine a U.S. president, then the concern would in theory be levering the Justice Department in a way that actually matches his or her goals. But I think that's at least held accountable then at the level of the president at the ballot box. And so one thing I think we need to do at the next opportunity is take an institution like the FBI. It can't be reformed, but to send a signal that we're actually just going to, at the federal level, shut that down. Now, I know that sounds extreme to some people, but if you think about it, at many localities, you have the police department and you have the local prosecutor. You don't have this separate investigative body in between. And the more layers of bureaucracy that you have, the more that is a formula for the creation of corruption. And so there is no perfect solution, but I do think the best solution of the next step we can take is take a lot of those bureaucratic layers and don't pretend to reform them. I think that's a false myth, but actually go in there and decimate them, shut them down in the legal sense. And I think that will have the effect of at least minimizing the layers that separate the elected party, such as the U.S. president or governor, from the so-called bureaucrats who are making the day-to-day decisions that often are weaponization and persecution through prosecution that I think is sadly widespread in this country and now long needs to come to an end.
Another fun one. Okay. Ross Smith wants to know, do you think we should pull out of NATO? And people have turned away from foreign policy, but it's still on people's minds.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's important. So look, I think about it as what alliances advance U.S. interests and which ones don't. And so the question is, if the rest of NATO allies are not doing their part in NATO, then I think it is a legitimate question to be asked of what are we getting out of this relationship? So I don't think it should be off the table. That's what I would say. So much of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party treats that as like a question that is unspeakable, right? That's off the table, outside of the Overton window. I don't think much should be outside the Overton window. I certainly don't think that question should be either. And so if we say that we're part of this alliance, but there's no permanent commitment to that for all of the future posterity. We're going to reevaluate what our commitments are, especially if other countries are not living up to their commitments. Take Germany, right? Country with less national debt per capita than ours, yet is not even spending as much of its GDP on military defense, not even as much as they're signed up to in their own commitments to NATO. NATO calls for every member to spend 2% of its GDP on its defense. Now, the U.S. has the biggest GDP of any NATO member, so the absolute dollars spent by the U.S. are going to be greater than any European country, and that's fine. But now you're talking about even as a percent of GDP, Germany, and I think 17 or so of the NATO countries, over half the NATO countries, are south of their own 2% of their own small GDP. I think it's offensive. I think it's wrong. And so I don't think it should be outside the acceptable bounds of possibilities to say that if others aren't carrying the weight of their commitments, we're going to reevaluate our own. I think that's perfectly fair to put on the table. But once you've put that on the table, I think we have a lot of leverage to say that, okay, maybe we are going to get something out of this that we're not getting today, but we have to be clear-eyed and ask ourselves that honestly, rather than saying that the first principles we're going to stay in NATO and then we're going to see whether or not there's some advantage we can derive from it. I look at it the other way around. How do we advance American interests? And if being part of NATO or anything else is actually going to advance that in a case where other people have skin in the game and are putting up, it's kind of put up or shut up is sort of my mentality there. And if other people aren't putting up, then they better shut up in their complaints about what we are or aren't going to do.
Right on. Okay. This is interesting. Is the writing on the wall for a large-scale cyber attack?
I think it is one of the areas where we're probably obviously more vulnerable now than we've ever been. We're actually better in the United States on the cyber offense side, interestingly enough, than we are on defensive cyber attacks. So Apoorv and I have actually been reading a book recently. It's by this guy, Scott Shapiro. It's actually a pretty good book about cybersecurity. We're vulnerable, but the attacks could actually be in a much more targeted sense right now than in a system-wide sense. So I actually was speaking to a privately owned company CEO. We were just meeting up for dinner a few weeks ago, and he was stressed out by the time I showed up because his entire business had already just been under threat. It was by a company. It's almost an industry. And it's a regularized industry. It wasn't even that rogue. It's not like a one-off pirate. It's like there's a whole process. There's like a helpline that you call into. They'll talk about what the actual ransom is. Here's the currency or the cryptocurrency or whatever that they want it in. It's run like with the professionalism of a corporation. And so it's less this idea of there's going to be some attack out of nowhere and it suddenly takes over all of our software, but more the organized nature of those cyber attacks are going to be more bottom up, addressing, I think, becoming just a cost of doing business for more corporations. That's what I see on the cyber side. I see that as distinct from what I do think could be a much more systemic vulnerability when it relates to, it's a different issue, but also one that's not discussed, the strength of our electric grid. See, there I think you could think about solar flares as a risk, but you could even think about an electromagnetic pulse attack as a risk. More than a cyber attack, which I think is going to be far more localized and finding pockets of vulnerability and turning it more into an industry. Most people who are engaged in cyber warfare are commercially motivated actors just behaving outside of the existing financial system. That's different when you think about nation-state actors that have the capacity to, from a distance, without once bombing the United States, take out our electric grid. And that's what I worry much more about, especially if it's combined with some cyber vulnerabilities. And if our electric grid is taken out, you're talking about, not being hyperbolic here, planes literally falling out of the sky. Your cars aren't going to work. Your refrigerators don't work. You're not going to be able to refrigerate your food anymore. You're not going to be able to refrigerate your insulin anymore. We're talking about a significant number of people within a matter of months dying in the United States, a significant portion of our population facing a mortality risk. So I think both of those are aspects of our homeland security that we have neglected. Both are important, but if I was to rank order the urgency and importance, I would even put the EMP defense and the hardening of our electric grid even ahead of some of our cyber defenses, though both are actually really important. The cyber defenses, a lot of that is going to take place, I think, through advances in private sector innovation to keep up with the innovation of the cyber attackers on the other side. On the hardening the EMP, hardening the electric grid against EMP attacks, I don't love a lot that our government has to actually do, but this is one of those areas where I think our government has a major job to play in defending our country. And I think our country and our defense budget is spent on a lot of things that have nothing to do with our own national defense. This is an area that is vital to our national defense, where I think we're actually underspending resources today.
Interesting. Guys, these are great questions. Please keep them coming. Just keep dropping them in the chat. I like this one. This is from Clifton Haston 55. How can we encourage young people to get married and start families to prevent population collapse?
Yeah, I actually think that that's a big issue. I mean, we are not really matching a replacement rate in this. We have a fertility rate that's problematic for the long run in the United States and the modern West as a whole. And it's not just the economic effects of that, where you have an upside down kind of inverted pyramid as people age, where you don't have a working population of people in their 30s or 40s that are able to support an older population. It's not just that we're facing, countries like Japan are facing. It's also a symptom of a deeper loss of happiness and fulfillment, because I do think it's not necessarily that every person is wired this way, but as a general norm, I think that most human beings for most of human history and most societies have been at their best when you do have family formation through marriage and actually bringing children into this world who are instilled with a value set that came from a generation before you. And so that, I think, is no accident that we see the loss of family formation and the loss of fertility over the same period that we see a rise in depression and anxiety and antipsychotic usage and antidepressant usage. I think those things go together. You could debate the causation. The reality is there's probably causation in both directions. But if that's the case, one of the ways to address it is to address some of that mental health epidemic that lies upstream. People are less likely to feel like they have the confidence or desire to engage in family formation, marital relationship, having kids, if they themselves have lost their own sense of self-worth. So then that goes back to what are some of the factors that are eroding our own sense of self-worth. Some of that comes through the early and premature use of social media. Social media is known to prey on the insecurities that many young people, including teenagers, have sooner than their own ability to be able to handle it. So one of the things I've talked about, it's not a particularly partisan idea, is that I think if you're not old enough to smoke an addictive cigarette by the age of 18 or have an addictive drink of alcohol by the age of 21, I don't think you should be using an addictive social media product by the age of 16 either, at least until before the age of 16. And so what does that have to do with family formation? I think it has to do with some of that loss of psychic fortitude that later causes people to be less inclined or have the lack of grounding or self-confidence in themselves to go on and have children. I think the other thing that we do a lot of is we have policies dating back decades now that pay people more money not to go to work than to go to work. That creates a sense of dependence on the government, a loss of freedom, and a loss of self-confidence and self-worth that further then contributes to the very communities that are actually receiving much of that so-called government aid correlate with many of the communities where you see loss of family formation as well. And by the way, those economic incentives then just pile up. You have the same types of programs that are paying people more not to go to work than to go to work are among those vestiges of the Lyndon Johnson Great Society, so-called Great Society, that also pay single mothers more money not to have a man in the house than to have a man in the house. The effective proposal that the government makes is, I'm Uncle Sam, you can be married to me. You're making more money off of this man than you are off that man that you were living with before. And that economic incentive, particularly in urban environments, and you see a lot of this in the cities, and people who have been the recipients of so-called aid coming from that Great Society project that have also impeded family formation and fertility in the United States. And then look, I think that it's not unrelated to the debate about abortion policy in this country, really. I mean, I think if you're subsidizing an anti-fertility measure, there's an entirely different path to somebody actually coming to a pro-life position in this country to say that good things in life lead to more life. And if you're actually impeding new formation of life or bringing new life into the world, which, by the way, was the objective of organizations like Planned Parenthood, founded by Margaret Sanger, effectively as a kind of eugenic project to stop certain races from proliferating. You're not supposed to say it that way, but that was really at the heart of certain quasi-eugenic population diminishing measures that were taken by Planned Parenthood and otherwise that's also a completely separate basis to stand for pro-life policies that favor all else equal, more fertility and bringing more children into this world rather than fewer. So those would be a few different things, from psychological fortitude through through the premature use of social media, all the way to disincentives to work, which lead to the loss of economic mobility for prospective parents and the loss of self-confidence, to policies that outright pay women more money not to be married than to be married, to even policies relating to, frankly, pro-abortion policies that have disincentivized family formation and disincentivized bringing more children into the world.
Psychological fortitude. That is interesting.
Yeah.
The great never ends up being great. Great society, great reset. It kind of leads into
the
next.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
The great's never that great.
Yeah. It's the self-proclaimed great stuff.
Right. Well, this leads into the next question. It seems to be really on people's minds, which is, what is the liberal end game of the open border?
I think this one is simpler than it first seems, right? Just track the incentives. Mm-hmm. And even before tracking the incentives, they've made this one really easy. They've talked about their own incentives. If you go back to, there's a Politico piece back in 2013 written by a thoughtful liberal scholar. If you go back to the likes of what even Joe Biden and Mayorkas were saying, actually, of all people, you look even 10 years ago, the likes even more recently of Stacey Abrams, they've been saying it for years, that mass migration is part of ensuring lasting electoral majorities for the Democrat Party. So the incentive of the Democrat Party is, it turns out, to have more votes to put Democrats in office. And the general presumption is that people who cross the border illegally but are eventually granted amnesty are, over the long run, going to prop up those electoral majorities in a way that actually make those more lasting. So that's the base incentive. Mm-hmm. Maximize the import of votes, of future votes. That's the open border policy. And minimize the export of votes. That's opposing deportations. That's what's going on. Now, does that actually match the behaviors? Turns out it matches their rhetoric. It matches their behaviors. And let's just take two different issues. Because in principle, if people are thinking about individual issues based on that individual issue, then you would expect a distribution of views of where somebody lands on election integrity questions, of whether a driver's license should be required to vote. That would seem to be a totally separate question from what our border policy should be, right? These are two completely separate topics. So you could have four quadrants, two issues, 2 by 2, you could have four quadrants. One is you could have people who support open borders, but also support strong voter ID laws. You could have people who support strong voter ID laws and support a strong border. I'm in that category. You could have people who are in favor of loose voter ID laws and a loose border, or people who want loose voter ID laws but a strong border. And what you would expect if people are actually analyzing each of these issues independently is that you'd have about a quarter of people in each of those different quadrants. What you actually see is something really funny. The very people who are most in favor of open borders, effectively open borders, which is to say that you're not going to enforce the law for people who cross the border illegally, are the exact same people who also are opposed to voter ID laws when it comes to voting at the ballot box. So that shows that that level of correlation says those two issues are not separate issues. They're part and parcel of the same project, lasting electoral majorities for Democrats. Maximize the imports of votes, minimize the export of votes. That's what's at issue. Now, it comes to a head where you see that what would a Democrat say right now is, well, no, it's Republicans that stopped the passage of that new bill that was proposed with some level of bipartisan support. Nonsense, because most of what's happening at our southern border is not the fault of the absence of laws. It's the failure to enforce the existing laws that are already on the books. So we don't need new laws actually to secure the border. We need a new president who actually enforces those laws. We need a new Homeland Security secretary who is actually enforcing the laws that are already on the books. It surprises many people to hear this, but Remain in Mexico is still the law of the land in the United States of America. It's just not being enforced. Why is it not being enforced? The party responsible for enforcing it has vested interests to make sure that it's not enforced as it relates to winning at the ballot box. So that's actually what's going on.
Randy, that was a great question. Okay, Nathaniel Sellis, another great question. You talked about defeating the deep state. Could you elaborate on the intentions of the deep state?
The intention of the deep state is actually, it's interesting. we're tempted to see it as something that is nefarious, hateful of the people who suffer at the hands of the deep state. The reality is it's actually even more twisted. The actual objective is one of benevolence, and I'll tell you what I mean. Okay. So for most of human history, the basic view was the people could not be trusted to decide who governs. Right? If we leave it to the people, they're going to create a planet that burns itself, overheats itself to its very end, that people are going to say things that other people can't handle. The idea that you get to speak your mind as long as I get to in return, that's a crazy idea. The idea that every person, you and I and anybody else, can have their say counted equally at the ballot box. That's a ridiculous idea for most of human history, because the basic thought is people would give themselves what is worse for them if they're actually left to self-govern. So the old world project of monarchy, and for most of human history, dating back even to most ancient civilizations, is that it takes an enlightened elite not to accumulate power for themselves, but out of their benevolence to do what's right for the rest of society that demands leadership, that demands a government, that demands some level of being told what to do so that it's actually best for them. That's really what the modern deep state is all about. What is the deep state? The deep state is the people who are never elected to run the government, who are exercising political power. In old world Europe, that used to be a king. In today's world, it's a technocrat or a bureaucrat. But once you understand that, it actually starts to make much more sense. Is most of those people working at, pick your favorite three-letter agency, FDA, FTC, SEC, EPA, the list goes on, TSA, God knows what, are people who believe that they're doing what they're doing, impeding your liberties, not because it helps them at your expense, but because it's the right thing for you, even though you don't know it. Right. And when you see that this is how it's always been done for most of human history, here's the real, I think, for me at least, eye-opener is what we see in America today is really just a reversion to the norm of human history. Right? 1776 was the aberration, right? We are the weird ones. So for most of human history, it was done the other way. And then we did this strange thing that said, despite that tendency, for better or worse, and this is a crucial part of this, it's for better or worse, that's the bargain. For better or worse, we the people decide who governs. And what you're seeing now, 250 years in, and it's reared its ugly head several times in our history, and it's rearing its ugly head now, is that old world monarchical monster that's basically skeptical of self-governance itself. That's what we're seeing in the country today. That's the actual motivation of what lies behind the deep state, not the nefarious intention. But the only thing more frightening than a nefarious intention is actually a benevolent one. And that's what I think is actually motivating the sanctimonious sense of purpose that guides a lot of these so-called bureaucratic actors. It's not that they think they're doing something wrong for you. It's that they believe that they're doing what's right for you, which is why they will not be constrained even as the people try to constrain them. It's like at the end of Fight Club. You seen that movie?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like the Brad Pitt character is like, they tell him, they're like, no, we need to constrain you. He's like, I had told you that this is exactly what you were going to say, and they still keep going with it anyway. That's what I see in actually the modern bureaucracy.
That is one of the most eloquent answers I've heard you ever give on this, and you weaved in a Fight Club
and it's
reference
a good movie.
Too.
It's a good movie. Yeah, it's worth actually making me want to watch that tonight.
It's pretty good. This is a question from our Rumble audience. Hello, Front Rov. I think this is a great question. If the home ownership value is gone for Americans, and I think the subtext here is if home ownership isn't maybe feeling like it's attainable for a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, then what's the most important thing for Americans? In other words, what would be the new piece of the American dream, maybe? So I want to say a piece about the home ownership dilemma. It is very difficult for young Americans to own a new home because homes prices have skyrocketed. There's a very practical reason behind why. Mm-hmm. We have constrained the supply of housing in this country. Mm-hmm. There are these so-called land use restrictions, not just from the federal government, though the EPA and others play a role in this. There are land use restrictions that come at the state and local level that say you can't construct smaller houses effectively on smaller plots of land. And those are just regulations that constrict the supply of housing, but especially smaller housing. And that disproportionately affects new home buyers
who may not want a large home as their first home, but may even want a small home. If the supply of all housing has decreased, first of all, it's the laws of supply and demand. If demand stays flat and supply goes down, prices go up. But the prices especially go up of those small houses that first-time home buyers might otherwise be interested in. So there's a clear answer to this. It's not the only answer, but it's a very clear answer. It's an easy one. Eliminate those land use restrictions. That makes home ownership back within reach. Now, in the status quo where that isn't happening, I love the premise of that question that, okay, if it's not home ownership, then what else? And I like that question because even if you're thinking about living the American dream, it's not about a physical thing, right? It's not about fetishizing. Just because you have a home and you own the home rather than renting it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a greater degree of innate happiness or even agency, right? You could solve for owning a home, but that doesn't get to the root cause of it. What is the American dream about right now? I think it's about the ability to find some portion of your life where you're able to pursue who you are, to do something that actualizes your actual self while still having enough time to do what's required to put food on the dinner table. And I think right now the position that many of those people who can't afford a home are caught in, and the thing that frustrates so many Americans, especially young Americans, is not just the fact that they can't own their home, but are instead renting a home or renting an apartment. That's not the source of the frustration. It's that it happens to be those same people who have to work so much just to make those ends meet at a wage level that precludes them from pursuing their other passions as well. Now, I think the ultimate manifestation of living the American dream, and I have been fortunate, this is what I consider to be fortunate, not living in a nice house or whatever, and those are not things that are nice to have. But the thing that makes me most fortunate, I think makes anyone most fortunate, is the ability to do what you're passionate about, to do what you're called to do, and still for that to be your way of making a living or not having to worry about putting food on the dinner table. That's the true American dream. That's true human agency. And so even for young people who weren't able to necessarily own a home, and we haven't fixed these land use restrictions, if we were still able to improve wages in this country through economic growth and otherwise, such that first best choice, your job, was also your actual calling, boy, is that a beautiful thing. I've lived at parts of my life, certainly straight out of college, where that probably wasn't the case, and that's okay. You did something principally because of the money. But you still have enough space in your life to be able to pursue the kinds of things that give you happiness outside of laboring and toiling to put food on the dinner table. That's the true American dream, is that sense of mobility and that latitude to be able to pursue your passion and for the things that you do to really be an expression of who you are.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Yes. We don't have to reinvent the game. It was written for us 250 years ago. And I think the latitude, it didn't say life, liberty, and a roof over your head. A roof over your head's important. But it's more fundamental than that, right? You have life. Yes. You have the liberty, the freedom to live as you will and to pursue your own sense of happiness. And part of that is matching. And actually, who said this? David Brooks, I think, was the guy who said this. I mean, happiness is one of these, nebulous concepts. What does it really mean, or how does one pursue happiness? Does it really come from the things that you get? Rarely does it. He described it as not David Brooks, Arthur Brooks. Yeah, David Brooks is not really having too many original things to say.
Arthur Brooks writes a lot of happiness.
Arthur Brooks is who I misspoke. Who said this? Earned success, right? So if you just have material success that you inherit, you actually have a wide range of unhappiness. I've seen this firsthand amongst kids who I went to college with at Harvard or elsewhere that were the kids of billionaires. It's very difficult to find your own place in the world. And not to say that that's an impediment to happiness, but it can be. And on the other hand, if you're not able to put food on the dinner table, it's very hard to talk about your on your Maslow's hierarchy types of needs of purpose that you're fulfilling. But if you're able to achieve earned success in a material sense of actually having your needs met, but in the sense that you actually earned it, and especially earned it through doing something that was an expression of who you are, I think that is a true path to the pursuit of happiness. But I think it's also a description of the American dream, is it's a country that gives you the latitude to do that without a government or a system standing in your way.
I think that's so inspiring, and it's true, These are so many great questions. Okay, we got time for probably 2 more.
Sure.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, guys, this has been phenomenal. Keep the questions coming. This one seems like it's a little bit funny, but has a serious undertext or undertone here. This is from Impotence on Rumble. Is there a possibility?
Impotence?
Impedance.
Oh, okay, got it.
But the question seems a little funny but serious. Is there a possibility of requiring legacy news to take responsibility for misinformation or misrepresentation, or at least posting a disclaimer prior to every news story as an opinion?
So look, I think we got to be really careful about the government dictating what any news organization does or doesn't do. The right answer is actually competition. And we're getting the question via Rumble, which is a great source of competition to that legacy media. So, part of the reason I invested in Rumble, part of the reason I'm on Rumble right now is I want to see platforms like this succeed at scale in diluting a lot of that poison that we're fed from centralized corporate media to relevance. But that's how we've got to do it, in a decentralized way through competition. Because otherwise, if you have the levers of power in the government deciding what those press animals can or can't say, well, we might be able to do that to CNN or MSNBC today, but they're going to be doing it to the likes of Rumble tomorrow. And that's not a game that I think either side should be wanting to play. Yeah. But what we do need is that greater space for that competition. And then it's going to take people with the actual spine to stand up and to cut through a lot of those narratives. I didn't succeed in my endeavor to be the next U.S. president, but one of the things that we did, I mean, you're a critical part of the campaign on this front of it, is to call out a lot of those lies to their face and to say, you know what, if you're the same institutions that lied to us about the Russia collusion hoax, that lied to us about where COVID came from, that lied to us about the Hunter Biden laptop and tried to censor us from talking about it. Mm-hmm. And the list goes on. Jussie Smollett. You got the Covington Catholic kids. You got, a lot of the Nashville transgender shooter manifesto, the truth about what really happened on from January 6th to back to even what the basis was for the 2008 financial crisis and bailouts. You could go straight down the list all the way back to the premise for invading Iraq. Some of these are Republican issues. Some of these are Democratic issues. You have a media that has systematically lied to its people. And if the media that's supposed to hold the government accountable now that isn't holding the government accountable, it might take a new generation of aspirant political candidates to then hold the media accountable as well. So I tried to do that in my capacity as a private citizen who was running for U.S. president. But I think the ultimate solution is going to be through more market competition, including decentralized platforms like Rumble, where this question came from, to be able to challenge that monopoly, if you will, on truth that much of the corporate media has enjoyed. And that's probably why I'm such a hardliner when it comes to internet censorship, because that really is the last line of defense and the last check on centralized corporate media. And what you see today, that big threat to internet freedom, actually comes back from where I said we don't want the solution coming from, which is from the government. The government's now telling certain social media companies, not just telling them, threatening them, to say that, you know what, you have to censor certain speech through the back door that we couldn't censor through the front door. That's really how we're having a chokehold on the competition, that is decentralized platforms like this one, to check that mainstream legacy media. And so that's why I'm a hardliner on making sure that that government does not, through the back door or otherwise, limit free expression on the internet. But out of consistency, I can't then be the person who says that the government should also make requirements of what CNN does or doesn't say. For my part, I'll say the government isn't going to regulate that, but that government shouldn't regulate what you're able to say on Rumble or YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or X or anything else either.
This is a follow-up question from me because somebody asked you earlier about the intentions of the deep state, and you said it's not necessarily that it's nefarious, it's benevolent, and that's almost worse.
That's how they think of it.
Right, exactly. So do you think with the mainstream media, same question, you think the intention is nefarious, or you think they actually think they're being benevolent in their coverage and what they choose and not choose to cover?
So I think that it is it's a good question. I think that most of the people have convinced themselves that it is their own benevolence. Here you also have self-interest mixed in because these are commercial models that have a vested interest in keeping competition out. So I think there's a little bit of cynicism baked in, but I think they've convinced themselves of the lie. It's like what Sartre said is the ultimate lie is not to the other, but to yourself. I think that's a lot of what I see in the people in that mainstream media machine, is that it's their own sense of nobility and sanctimony that binds them to attach themselves to the lies in the way they have. The basic idea is, I mean, it's like the Jack Nicholson character in A Few Good Men, right? You can't handle the truth. You need me on that wall, right? That's the mentality of the people who are calling the shots at CNN or MSNBC or anywhere else is, okay, even if I know what I'm telling you may not be the exact whole truth, you need me on that wall because you can't handle the truth. And what we say to the deep state, I think, should be the same thing we say to the effective deep state that exists outside the government, including in the mainstream media, is that no. We, the people, can handle the truth. We demand the truth. We require the truth. That's who we are, and that's why we live in the United States of America.
Do you think they could ever be incentivized to self-correct? Or you think it's past that point?
No, I think they could. I mean, that's where market competition comes in. If enough people opt out, I mean, CNN's not in a great financial spot. And I think if they had done a better job of earning the public's trust, I think they would be in a better financial spot. And I think a big part of that is through the advent of a free and open internet with platforms from X to Rumble offering actual alternatives to where people are able to consume that information. And so in some sense, you're seeing that market mechanism through competition slowly but surely, I believe, deliver that solution. And so that's why I'm optimistic and don't want to take a step back by using a blunt measure like a government that we would control or our side or whatever would control to commit some of the same mistakes that the other side has in the meantime.
Okay, I think this might be a good last question.
Okay.
I sense that there might be some, okay, maybe actually we can, well, guys, there's so much demand. Should we take maybe one or two more?
Okay.
That's very
all right,
you.
well, yeah,
I feel
let's do
like,
it.
okay.
Let's do it. Yes,
all right.
that is
But I
very
feel
me.
like there's emotion behind this question. It's a simple question, but I feel like it's coming from someone's heart. This is from P. Jean, and she's truly asking, can this country ever truly be united?
Yes, actually. I believe we are. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to see that. I think part of unity is understanding what you're unified on. And that doesn't mean you're unified on everything. But I think we have to separate what are the basic rules of the road versus the areas where we can still have vehement disagreements. Abortion policy, gun rights versus restraints. I mean, these are deep-seated issues related to, what we think taxation rates should be, what's an appropriate distribution of wealth in a society. You have deep-seated disagreements on these issues. But I think the foundational rules of the road that this country was founded on are even more fundamental than any of those things. It's that you get to speak your mind as long as I get to in return. It's that we, the people, create a government that is accountable to us, not the other way around. The moral duty of our elected leaders is to our citizens, not that of another country. That the people who serve in public service should serve the public, not themselves. And that we're proud of that. That you get ahead with your own hard work and commitment and dedication, with merit, the best person getting the job or achieving a reward without a government interfering in that process. Those are foundational ideas that I think 80+% of this country is united on today and has been united on for the better part of the last 250 years of our national history. So I think much of this myth, and I do think it's a myth of division, is projected on us by the algorithms that will maybe even governing who does or doesn't see this very conversation we're having, by cable news. If you actually do it, and it was part of the pleasure of the last year, it was the honor of my life to travel this country. You were there for much of it, to see tens of thousands of people like in the flesh, just in rooms, disintermediated by cameras or anything else, many of whom disagree, from college campuses to the inner cities to rural or conservative communities too. I think 80+% of them agree on those basic rules of the road. And so do I think it's possible for us to be united? Yes, because I think we actually already are, but we've been so taught that we're not, that becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy. And so on those basic rules of the road, yes, we are. And you know what? If we disagree on corporate tax rates or whatever, those are details. But my message to the country is, if you agree on the basic principles of 1776, free speech, self-governance, merit, then you know what? We're on the same team. And I think if we're willing to acknowledge that the principles guide whether we're on the same team or not, I think 80+% of us in this country are. Half the 20% on the other side are certainly people younger than me who I think we can bring along by speaking to those ideals and showing them those ideals. And then I think there is a fringe 10% minority in this country who hates this country and what we stand for. And that's the kind of ideological war that we're in, where either you believe in merit or you believe in group quotas. You can't have both. Either you believe in free speech or you believe in censorship. You can't have both. right? Either you believe in the exceptionalism of these ideals or you believe in apologizing for them. You can't have both. And in that side, I call it a war because there's no middle ground. But 80, 90% of this country, I think, is united. And I think that it's up to us now to open our eyes and see through that artifice, that artificial narrative of division, to actually see that. And once you see it, it becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy.
I love that. Okay, this is from Missy. She wants to know, how would you handle the Federal Reserve? Do you think it should ever have been established? And how do we handle the looming debt? I feel like that every day grows. And it's like it's never talked about in the media, but every day it's there.
Oh yeah, it's it obviously grows. And some of that's a fiscal issue, not just a monetary policy issue. I don't think the Fed should have been formed, but given that it was formed, what's the right answer now? And it's codified in statute. Is put it back in its cage. One mandate of dollar stability. It actually relates to some of the issues even relating to Bitcoin and whatnot that I talked about at the very beginning. Stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, period. Peg it to a basket of commodities. We were on the gold standard for most of our national history. We actually had the greatest economic growth we've had in this country for most of the period that we were actually on that gold standard. The objection to this is that it ties the government's hands. That says, okay, well, you don't have that ability to smooth over the business cycle. Well, you know what? Tying the government's hands is actually a good thing because it restores the intrinsic worth of the dollar itself, which is better for our economy and better for our long-run geopolitical security as well. I think that's critical to be able to preserve the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which is better for the United States. And you know what? This is why alternatives like Bitcoin that provide an opt-out from that financial system are a good thing, all else equal, is that they at least hold the dollar's feet to the fire. And so I'm not one of these evangelists of, some cryptocurrency or Bitcoin or whatever for its own sake, but I like it as a competitive balance on the existing financial system as it exists.
I like this question a lot. This is from Winglow Mining. Hope we got that right. Thanks for joining. How can we bring the government back to the minimal piece it was designed to be? But I also think the subtext there is, how can we get our government back to being a government that represents what it was intended to be in 1776?
I think it starts with shutting down the fourth branch of government, the one that our Constitution never envisioned in the first place. There's three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Let's go back to that. That's what our framers envisioned. Yet most political power and most of the employee headcount in Washington, D.C. is in that fourth branch of government, the administrative state. I think we need to shut down as much of the administrative state as is possible. In my campaign, I said that should be at least 75%. I stand by that as a worthy goal. At least. I think it could be much greater than that. You're still talking about a seven-figure number of federal employees on the back of a 75% reduction, which I think is itself, you could argue, is a problem. And so people want to criticize me for saying that's not far enough. I'll say, great, bring that criticism on. Yeah. But first, let's take step one, which is that 75% headcount reduction. And the good news about this is I think this is something that the next executive branch can implement, because it's within the executive branch. There's two of the most important things that need to be done in this country can be done using executive power without asking Congress for permission or for forgiveness. One is enforcing the laws already on the books to make sure that we actually do have borders in this country, that we actually have a southern border, which arguably we don't right now, to restore the rule of law as it pertains to mass migration, to end birthright citizenship for the kids of illegals to whom it doesn't apply. All this can be done through executive action. And the second thing is shut down the overgrowth of the executive branch itself. By definition, that sits under the executive branch too. And so without asking for Congress or for permission or for forgiveness, those are two things that can be done by the next president and by the next executive branch that I think get the heart of this country back, ending the mass migration crisis, restoring a nation with borders, and then shutting down about 75% of the federal bureaucracy by way of headcount included. And that's the first and biggest step that we can take back to the 1776 vision of a limited government of the people, for the people, and by the people.
God bless America.
Yeah.
Wow. So many great questions. Any closing thoughts for everybody?
We're just kind of having fun with this, but give us feedback.
Yeah.
This is my first time, our first time doing this, but I actually missed our travels across the country. It's been about a little over a month since I ended the campaign. And so as I'm moving on to this next phase, the part that I missed the most is
staying in touch with all of you guys, getting great questions like this. Doesn't have to be at a pizza ranch in Iowa or at a campaign rally. In fact, this is, I think, a lot more mass connectivity in ways of getting great questions. So I enjoyed this. I'm open to doing more of this. We're right now just having fun, keeping things pretty informal. But if you guys like this or anything you think we could do better, as well as advice on whether, doing this a few times a week would be interesting or not, I'm totally open to all of that feedback. But today we just wanted to, return to talking to you all directly, take some great questions and have some fun. So I enjoyed that. Give us the feedback, and you know what? Maybe we'll do it again. So talk to you guys. Thank you.